Am I getting started straight away? All right. Hi, my name's Ben Deckrai, and I'm going to be talking to you about Apigility. Hands up if you've heard of Apigility before. Wicked. Right crowd. So Apigility, maybe I'll just go through the slides rather than just start talking randomly. It's touted as a new way, the better way of doing APIs. So it's probably important to know, hands up who doesn't know what an API is. Wicked, so I'll just rush through this bit. Essentially, it's a way of defining the way that you talk to a system where the functionality is independent of the implementation, so you can make changes to either and it doesn't affect either system at either end. It's like a communications protocol in the middle, I suppose, in a way. So you've got your code, remote code, communications channel in the middle, and a contract by which the two will communicate. So nowadays we think of APIs as web APIs, but there's a history to them. Before that, you would have things like HTML, JavaScript to jQuery. That's essentially an API, because when you define, like even at the C level, when you do function name, open parameters, that is a signature. That's the API. That's a contract by which one part of the code will talk to a function within the same application, even. But as I say, most of the time we talk about web services. SOAP is where it kind of first started. It's horrible. Don't go there if you don't have to. And nowadays you have REST. Using web application description language, REST service description language, I believe, or hypermedia, which is kind of the newer way of getting the results to describe itself. Building APIs, most of the time you do it from scratch. Hands up who's written an API from scratch. Hands up who would like to write another API from scratch. Yeah, figured. The other way is using an API builder. It's a rapid API development system, kind of like RAD for APIs. They're fairly new on the market. You might have heard a few of them. Apigility is the one I'm going to be talking about, but there's Deployed, Apiary, and Accelerator. Accelerator is actually a system for designing apps, but they do have their own API builder type thing built in. Has anybody heard of Apiary? I think that's probably one of the more common ones. It's basically an online designer where you can do the same kind of thing as Apigility. But the difference between the three around the outside and Apigility in the middle is the ones that have just faded slightly are all software as a service. And you can download them in certain ways, but it's still out in the web somewhere. So disclaimer, I don't work for ZEND. I have no affiliation with ZEND. I have played with Apigility a little, but they do tout themselves as being the world's easiest way to create a high-quality API. So, how do you install it? As with the talk I gave a couple of days ago, everything seems to be going through Composer nowadays. Anybody not used Composer? So Composer is basically a way of, it's almost like a makefile, and it downloads things from GitHub repositories and all over the place. You have a JSON descriptor that defines the requirements that you have, and you basically do a Composer install, and it'll fetch all of the files, put them into nice directories, uses PSR4, I believe, which is basically a way of organizing files so that you can have an autoloader that knows exactly where to go to load something just by instantiating a class. It's quite cool. So I've kind of fallen in love with Composer. I'm not sure if you can read that up there, but basically that says Composer, create project. And then on the end there we've got ZF Campus, ZF Apigility skeleton. And because there's no other descriptor around that, it assumes it's a GitHub repository. So it's going to go to GitHub and grab that, stick it in a directory called OSDC. Now you run that. Really bad color scheme, isn't it? So basically it's now saying I'm going to install this, and I'm installing it from dev master, cloning it, and it pulls out all of the dependencies automatically. I haven't had to code any of that. And then finally it finishes, it's done a whole lot of stuff, and at the bottom it says, do you want to remove the existing version control system history? So you've just pulled something out of a version control history. You could keep that if you wanted, which is useful if you're developing further on it perhaps, or you want to be able to look at the changes. But in most cases when you're starting a new project, you want to say no to that because you're going to start your own repository. So I'll say no. Well, I'll say yes actually, because I want to remove them. Logic fail. So that's installing it. That takes 10 minutes, which is why I did it using slides. The first time, there's a bit of caching and stuff that can help. So there are two ways of doing it, of using Apigility for REST-based services. There's database connected and code connected. I'm going to give you a demo of the database connected first, because it's a really simple, very fast way of setting up an API. So let me just bring this window across. Make that a lot bigger. Can you read that at the back, or shall I turn some lights off? Can you read that? Lights off. Excuse me a second. How's that?
Oh, that's lovely.
Mood lighting. I'll make it you can. I will be asking tricky questions at the end to test. So you'll see at the bottom here I've got two directories, Apigility and Apigility statuslib. Statuslib is an extra package that I'm going to demo in a bit, and to save myself the 10 minutes of standing here because I only have 19 left, this is how I'm going to use Composer. Done. So I now have a directory called OSDC. Let me just get rid of those two, just in case there was something left over from when I practiced it. And let's do that again. Right, so now I've got a directory called OSDC, which is a direct checkout of Apigility. And if we have a look at the composer.json, just for those who haven't seen Composer before, this is a basic JSON document that describes the product that I want to install. And then there's a whole lot of extra information down at the bottom, such as the minimum requirements. So you can see it's pulling out everything that's required by this application. When you first install Composer, so I'm going to be using PHP at the command line as a server. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the later versions of PHP will act as a web server itself, which is really awesome for rapid testing and development and stuff. So I'm going to start a server listing on any IP address on port 8080. The document root is going to be, well, the files that it's going to try and send it to first is public. So if the file exists, then show it. Otherwise, send it through to index.php. So now I've got something listing on port 8080. I'll just switch across to browser. Refresh that. And we have Apigility running. That's cool, but there's an error. So Apigility comes with a test mode. So I'm just going to clear that a second. And you can actually call PHP on the command line and pass in parameters, and I'm going to enable development mode. And just like that, restart, we now have an admin tool for creating an API. So other than the 10 minutes installation time, I've executed one command line to enable debugging or development mode. I've started a web server, and I have this. And now we can get started and create some APIs. So let's create a new API. So I want to model conference management. Let's create a conference API. And I'm going to create a new REST service. And I want it to be DB connected. I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly, just because of time limitations, but it's fairly easy to find the way through if you want to do that later. So because it's a new install, we don't have any database adapters created, so I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to use the PDO-MySQL driver. Given this is not a production machine, I don't mind passing on my root database credentials, and that's all we need at a minimum to set up no, it's not a minimum. The database name would be useful. Conference. Excellent. Right, so we've got a database adapter. Let's jump back into APIs at the top. Conference API, REST services, create a new REST service, database connected. So now I've got the list there, and I'm going to grab that adapter. Now you can see I'm reusing the name a lot, but you could call these whatever you want. So I've got a database with a table called conference, and I'm creating a conference API that has a conference REST method inside it. And there it is. And I called it Conference, which is probably going to break most of my copying and pasting for the rest of the show. So let me just fix that up quickly. Come on. Oops, code connected. Conference. Excellent. Right, so now I have a plugin, because it responds with JSON. by default. I've got a plugin to interact with it as a REST service because I couldn't find a plugin for Firefox that will accept the application plus something /JSON format and automatically show it on screen. So this is kind of a nice little interface just to play around with the REST thingy. So I'm going to make a request to, can I cheat? I can. Localhost port 8080/conference. 500 internal error. Wicked. I haven't created the database. So let's create the database. Bit bigger. MySQL. So here's some code I prepared earlier. Hey? Oh yeah, sorry, I'm just jumping into a copy and pastable thing over here, so I don't have to type everything. So I'm going to create a database called conference, and I'm going to use it. And I'm going to create a table called conference. And it's got an ID, a name, a start, and an end time date time. Basic information that you need. I won't go any further than that. So let's jump back and run that again. So here we now have a response. Bear in mind, I haven't done any coding. I clicked about 7 or 8 different buttons in Apigility, and now I have, and this is the hypermedia linking type stuff. The response gives me a list of all the conferences, so there's the array of conferences. There aren't any yet. Well, you can see the page count, page size, total items already in there, but there's a whole lot of links information. So the response includes a link back to itself. And we'll notice in a minute, once we add them in, it'll come out with pagination links as well, all out of the box, which is kind of cool. So, still haven't looked at any of the code. I'm going to jump in and say, let's post a conference. And there it is. It's not very useful. Name is null, starts as null, ends as null, but we've got a link. That's kind of cool. And we've got an automatically generated ID. I still haven't written any code. So, in an effort to do as little typing as possible, I'll copy this over. Let's actually give it some data. Actually, before I do that, I need to define the data that's coming in. I could post that, but it's not really useful having an API that you can post information to that'll just create an object or an instance of whatever without having any valid information. So if we jump back to the API part here, this is where the conference API method was defined. I'm going to stick some fields in. And if I edit that, I can add the name, starts, and ends. Save. All right, that's done now. Again, I still haven't coded anything. So if I take that out, we'll now see that I'm getting validation error messages automatically in there. I could, if I want to, go in and put in, oops, let's go up and edit. So if I edit name, I can go down and say I want to add a filter. Put in trim. Save that change. So now if I jump back, oops, wrong one, that one there. Let's just send through first of all. Can everybody read that okay at the back? Yeah. So I'm going to send through a name, but I'm going to make it blank. So it automatically does content type validation, and what has happened is that the correct header hasn't gone through. So I've got this little application JSON. It's going to send that through as part of the request. Try that again. And it's saying the value required can't be empty, even though I passed a blank string in. So that is empty, I suppose. Let's add a space, or 2, or 3. And still the value required can't be empty. So again, still no coding, and I'm starting to put validation in. You can also put filters in, so you could take numbers and that kind of stuff out. But that's kind of boring, so I'll carry on with the crux of the demo. So let's create an actual conference. So this year's conference, 2014, November the 4th through 7th. Send that through, and we've got conference number 2. If we jump back to the database, there's the two records that have gone in, and I've still done no coding. Right, so the downside to this is that, let's say we wanted to put in 2015. We've now got a conference that starts in 2015 and ends in 2014 because I forgot to pass that through. That's never going to happen, is it? So one thing that I can't do at the moment using the database connected is to do logic level at that to stop it. So let's see how quickly I can finish this demo. Database connected services, you can use a DB adapter, specify a table, and have access to a virtual resource, which gives you read access to that table, and you can read and write and all those things, but the functionality is delegated to Apigility itself. Development is rapid, but customization is harder. So if all you need is read-write access, and there is some authentication as well, which I haven't covered, but if you just need read-write access, that's as simple as it gets, and it's pretty cool. So let's quickly jump to code connected services. So what I'm going to do is jump back up here. I'm going to stop this one. So I'm going to use statuslib, which is a library that's developed for the purposes of giving a demonstration of Apigility by the Apigility team. And it's called statuslib because it's about statuses. It's kind of like a Twitter clone. So I'm going to grab the statuslib version of the download, which is essentially exactly the same, only I also ran an extra line being that one there. So from the OSDC directory itself, composer requires statuslib example. So let's copy that to OSDC statuslib. So we've got a separate directory. So the directory structure is pretty much exactly the same. There's some extra files in there because I've added another dependency. And I'm going to enable the development mode and start the server on 8080. So if we jump in now and come back up to the top, I'm going to make a GET request on that. And the first thing that happens is there's an error. Well, the reason for that is I've got a brand new install. And there's nothing in here anymore. So let's jump back to the top. Create a new one. We don't need a database anymore. Let's try that again. Thank you. REST services, create a new one. It's going to be code connected. Conference. So now if I jump in here and run this again, we get an error, method not allowed, 405. So this is where the coding comes in. So, come on, listen to my commands. Don't maximize over this side. There we go. Right. It's showing me the context menu on this screen. That's really convenient. Right. So here's the directory structure. And we have a module, and in there we've got conference, and there's the source, and there's the API version 1. It does versioning as well, which is cool. And in here we have 4 classes that have been created automatically. We've got a collection, so when you say show me all conferences, it uses that. We've got the entity. These are actually very basic stubs, and they use a lot of the back-end stuff automatically. I won't go into those. The resource itself is how you interact with the resource, and then you've got the resource factory, which is the instantiation of that, or the invoking of it. Excuse me, my phone's ringing. Thank you. It's usually annoying when somebody else's phone rings. It's just embarrassing when it's the presenter's. So in here we have the stub holder, and what I'm going to do is, because we're using the statuslib code, is excuse me while I find the right place to copy from. We need to modify the application to use, there's conference as well, excellent. Statuslib. We need to change the autoloader to allow us to use statuslib. So there's a distribution file there, which I'm just going to save as, let's come up over this side. So I've just saved that as local.php. And in here, we basically need to provide information about a mapper. So when you use this, you're mapping from one format to another. We're actually going to return a blank array because name is name and starts is starts and ends is ends. So that's we don't actually need to do any mapping, but we need to tell the system that there isn't any mapping. So in data, we create a new file called statuslib.php, and in there I just return an array. And then you can see it's getting quite complicated already. So in the resource, I now need to use the mapper interface. I need to have a local mapper, which is passed in the constructor. And now, all of these, you can see we're returning API problem. That's basically like the way that the API sends messages, error messages back. So I'm going to replace all of these with mapper code. So create will call mapper create. Delete will call mapper delete. We're not going to bother with delete list. Fetch will do fetch. Fetch all. Does fetch all. Patch is the same as an update. So this patch one here, I'm just going to call update. And we're not going to do replace list. We're just going to do update here and that one there. So I've just updated all of those to call methods on the mapper. Everybody kind of with me? Cool. Let's see if that's worked. Actually, I think there's one other thing I need to do. Yes. So I mentioned over here that this resource factory is where it's instantiated. So we've got the invocation here. So because we're using a mapper, we need to pass the mapper in. So I just put in from the services that are passed in, I get the status lib mapper, which is one of the services that the system now has access to, and pass that into the conference resource. So with any luck, we now have the ability to make a request. That's a bit complicated. Right, let's jump through this because I realize I'm very low on time. So let's post this request that I had before, which was creating one with the wrong dates. We go through, and there it is, it's in there. Now you'll notice that the ID is a UUID or a GUID. And if we look at the database again, you'll see, so this one here was actually the fake one that we created before. If I run this again, just to prove a point. So that one ends in EA1A, and this one now ends in 3654, so they're separate entities in the system. If I go back and look in the database, we still only have 3. It's because I'm using Code Connect, and I haven't connected up to a database yet. I didn't get a database adapter or anything. So if I want to store that in a persistent area, I'm going to have to work that out later. But just to point out that that's not happening. But we still have that issue of the end date being before the start date. So if we jump back into the resource and find the create. So at this point here, I want to say if the data starts is greater than ends. Am I getting that right? Yep. Then I want to return, and you see in the doc block up at the top, you can return mixed or an API problem. Again, that API problem is returning error messages. I'm going to return, where's my key? There it is. Return an API, oops, no, return a new API problem, because we can't have old API problems. The autocomplete is coming up in this screen again. So the first parameter is the status. It's going to be status 400, and we're going to say date's wrong, just because I don't have time to put anything friendlier in. So let's try that again. Send that through. Response headers, internal server error. This is where debugging starts. Okay, I've made an error in the resources file on line 28. That'll be that semicolon missing. Love you, PHP. And back in here, send, bad request, response, date's wrong. So all that to say, it's tricky to set up, manage your own data store connections and slow development. You might have noticed the amount of extra functionality I got for storming through the creation of the code connect. For prototyping, it doesn't seem worth it. But the functionality is in your module then, so it's easier to control and it's easier to customize if you need to. It's, I believe it's quite hard. I've not managed to find an easy way to switch from database connected to code connected after the fact. So it's the kind of thing where you'd probably have to start from scratch. Not the whole system, but just that API method. Wrong key. So where to from here? It's still young. The helper systems, such as the admin interface, have been a little bit flaky over time. They're improving. They're doing code updates on it all the time. Documentation is good. It's a lot better than a lot of other younger systems out there. It is stable. It's based on ZEND Framework 2, and it's built by the ZEND Framework team. So they've taken a really stable underlying framework on which to build it, but the way that it's used is still quite young. But it has been defined as stable as of May this year, so it's okay for production apparently. Now, whether or not it's the right tool for the job, it's one of the very few API builders out there at the moment, and if you've got an existing ZEND Framework 2 project, it's probably really a good way of building the API onto that. If you've got a system in another language or something that's going to be hard for you to integrate a ZEND Framework 2 product into, then maybe it's not the right thing. But it's a start, and it's one of the early ones, so have a play. If you want to find it, it's at apigility.org, and that's me. Thanks for bearing with the speed typing. Any questions? I'll just switch the lights on again so I can see you. Ooh, crikey. Any questions? Gosh, you're a pretty lot. No, you'll want an afternoon tea break? Yes. Well, thank you for coming. Have a play. If you've got any questions at all, I'll be around for the rest of the conference and during the workshops tomorrow. Thanks.